Wonderful. Well, I've got my little official introduction that we'll go ahead and get out of the way. My name is Rachel Storm. I'm here today with Pat Grant, and it is, wow, it's October 1st, 2021. Pat, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit as far as like what we should know to get started, and then what the short version of what your role is with the National Western before we start kind of like unrolling all of that?
Happy to do that. My name is Pat Grant. I am Chairman Emeritus of the National Western Stock Show, otherwise known as the Western Stock Show Association. I was one of the early and first members of the board of the National Western Center Authority. And so I have a perspective on the challenges facing National Western Stock Show, what we went through and how it evolved and developed into what we have and know today.
Mm-hmm.
Is that appropriate, or do you want
Perfect.
more? Because okay,
that's a good short version for people starting off listening. That we'll unroll it from there. So before we get into kind of like the National Western Complex kind of things, would you mind talking about your role with the National Western Stock Show, and maybe like what your history is with that, how you got involved with that in the first place, and that kind of thing?
can you repeat that?
Yes. So before we get into you talking about the National Western Complex, would you mind talking about your role and how you got involved with the National Western Stock Show to start?
You bet. Well, that does back to my youth and my growing up on a farm and a ranch version of that. If you,
yeah.
I grew up on a farm west of Littleton,
Okay.
in a family of 7, mom and dad, and 4 brothers and sisters and a half brother. And it was a rural setting. The Grant, now known in part as the Grant Ranch, which has become a development on part of the old Grant Farm. Second vice president and a member of the executive committee of National Western Stock Show. And all of us kids were introduced at a very young age, mid to and so my family has been in ranching virtually from them all the way to the present. I went away to college, went to Colgate University, from which I graduated in 1967 in Hamilton, New York, because mom and dad wanted me to see and have a broader and larger perspective of what life is about than just being in Colorado. From there, I went to the Navy, and out of the Navy, I went into the practice of law, practiced law, got the political bug, ran for the legislature, and although I was a state representative from East Central Denver, including part of Glendale, I always had a soft spot and an important understanding and passion for helping rural Colorado. And so from 1984 to 1992, I served in the State House. And in 1985, was asked by the then chair, who had been president of National Western,
Mhm.
Nick Petrie, called and asked if I would join the executive committee of the National Western, which I agreed to do. And after successfully chairing a campaign for National Western to get Denver support for the National Western in 1989, which we called the $30 million bond issue. In 1990, I became president and CEO, or 1991, president and CEO of National Western, on which I then served in that same role until 2000. Brief summary, if that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So then that brings us up to the National Western Center. Could you talk about your relationship with the National Western Complex? What have your roles been? What have you kind of, I guess, just a little bit about that timeline?
I'm happy to do that, but Rachel, there's a significant amount of information and history that was part of the foundation of thinking behind what evolved into and became National Western Center. And if it's all right, I'd like to review that.
Yes, please do. Please do. Anytime there's a place where you want to add more information or defer from my question to focus on what you'd like to talk about, I'm very happy to do that all the way along the way.
If I may, let me issue a couple of disclaimers, if I may.
Sure.
Number one, I understand and know that a personal oral statement or oral history can and often contains bias. Having studied and majored in history, I will do all I can to be factual, to be forthright, but inherent in any recitation is a certain amount of bias.
Yep.
Number one. Number two, I think it's really important to understand that what you are asking to be done, stock show, particularly in the late 90s, leading up to 2010, which was shortly before Mayor Michael Hancock was elected in May or June of 2011.
Mm-hmm.
In 1998, we had completed construction of our event center at the National Western, and that was viewed as art. Many leaders of Texas rodeos and stock shows came to Denver to see what we were doing. And they didn't say much upon their visit, but clearly they went back to their respective cities of Fort Worth, Austin, and Houston, and said, look what Denver's doing. And so they got into a significant process in their cities, upgrading their complexes and their facilities. We were in many respects, in my view at the time, at the peak in 1998, but I could see that over time, we Nash Western faced significant challenge from 2 or 3 perspectives. Number one, our facilities were dated. Although we'd gone through a 1989 bond issue in facilities that were significantly dated, old, and frankly not conforming to the current competition and standard of other shows. Number two, we were growing. And number three, we did not have the financial ability to develop new construction on our own. So preventive maintenance costs build up significantly over time and really culminated at a serious point in the late part of my term. I did meet with then Mayor Wellington Webb, and I had meetings with him. He had other priorities, and particularly getting Denver voters' support for a new jail. He was and had been helpful in the 1989 bond issue, but I'm not sure he felt it was a priority. He then, as you know, passed the baton to Mayor John Hickenlooper, with whom I met, and John Hickenlooper, with his chief of staff, Roxanne White, who was very strong chief of staff and very good, very effective, pushed very hard for reasons and for a better understanding of the challenges facing us. So from 2003 to 2009, we undertook and did various studies. I met with the mayors and their staff, and I started to meet with other cities and individuals and ag leaders in other counties of Metro Denver. Mayor Hickenlooper had greater visions beyond being mayor of Denver, and so National Western was not a priority in his mind either. He did not turn a cold shoulder, but he was not particularly helpful. Mm-hmm. And if I may, I'm going to give you, I'm going to have to resort to some study, and they're still present. They're in the Golden Triangle, and Mark Naylor was the individual, and Mark Naylor and his team did a review and study and said that we should stay at our current site, even though it acknowledged we were facing some challenges at our current location. Mm-hmm. He recommended that we rebuild on the northwest part of the National Western, and that was not feasible, but at least Populous, which is an architectural design firm, mm-hmm. which undertook and agreed to do a study, and they confirmed, these are my memories, mm-hmm. that we had significant constraints on our site. They reported out in March of 2010, just before I stepped down as president and CEO, about the challenges of the existing site. If I may, let me go back mayor. And I can't recall, but either John Hickenlooper stepped aside or his second term ended.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure of which, but Bill Vidal became the interim mayor. Bill Vidal understood the challenges and understood that we were in discussions with many entities, many corporations outside of Denver. And he said that he would, as I recall, be supportive of our relocation to DIA, the current DIA.
Mhm.
And we had at least his office a year or two before election in 2011. In 2010, it was 20 years, when Paul Andrews succeeded me as president and CEO
Mhm.
in 2010.
Mhm.
So here we are at Mayor Hancock's being elected
Mhm.
and being confirmed as elected in, I believe, May or June of 2011.
Mhm.
Paul Andrews and I were and are members of a writing group called the Roundup Riders of the Rockies.
Mhm.
Paul and I were in the annual 1-week ride of the Roundup Riders in Southwest Colorado.
Mhm.
In the middle of the night, we had been called for a meeting with Mayor-elect Hancock in Denver. So Paul and I drove to Denver and we made a presentation in July of 2011.
Mhm.
And in that presentation, we made a presentation that our existing site had been determined to be unsatisfactory, constrained,
Mhm.
and there were serious challenges with the existing site, and that we had been received with some real interest by the city of Aurora, and particularly Gaylord Entertainment Company out of Nashville, Tennessee.
Mhm.
I had been careful not to make any firm or final commitments to Gaylord or to Aurora when we made that presentation. Mayor Hancock, and it was a meeting the following morning after our drive, Mayor Hancock met with us in the downtown Denver Urban Renewal offices, otherwise known as DURA, on California between 16th and 17th Street.
Mm.
He pushed us hard on why we felt compelled to move, what were the reasons, what were the rationale. He expressed concern about moving out of Denver, but he was at least listening and understanding. We were careful, and I was careful not to be critical of the other city leaders up to that point, understanding that they had other priorities. he listened to us. He listened to Paul in particular. He listened to why we were thinking of Gaylord at a site we called High Point, which is on the commuter line rail along Pena Boulevard up to DIA, and the advantages of being next to a commuter rail site. It's important to remember that in our meetings, I had been meeting, as I said, with a lot of entities, a lot of people in other counties, all in Metro Denver. I had even received encouragement from an individual who said, contact Salt Lake City, they would be interested in National Western. And I said, we're not interested in relocating to Salt Lake City. I have a fiduciary duty to do as president CEO, to do what I could as president CEO, to do what I could to strengthen the economic and facility vitality of the National Western. Shortly after we made that presentation to Mayor-elect Hancock, another study came out in August from a corporation or company called CSL, Convention, Sports, and Leisure. Convention, Sports, and Leisure did a marketing, financial, and economic viability study of our challenges, and they came to the conclusion that the current site where we had been from 1906 until 1911 was prohibitive because of its constraints and challenges. But that a new redeveloped site need to occur in Denver, or at least in Metro Denver. And it's interesting that that study came following upon the heels of the election of a new mayor. Mayor Hancock took our thinking, and over the next couple of years, a couple of things happened that are really important. Our chairman of the board, Jerry McMorris, had been in ill health. He died in 2012. Jerry McMorris was chairman when, in a good part of the time of my last years as CEO, Jerry McMorris and I were in agreement that there should be, quote, a little competition with Denver on the National Western. And he fully endorsed and supported talking to these other companies. One of the meetings that I had with Jerry McMorris and an individual by the name of Steve McCarthy. And Jerry introduced me to Steve McCarthy as being the chairman of the board of a company called Alem International, which was involved in the Olympic movement in providing security, programming, servicing, and consulting to the International Olympic movement. Jerry McMorris and Steve McCarthy and I had lunch and a meeting. And I'll never forget, I don't remember, it was when I was in the last year or two of my presidency as CEO. We talked about the global aspirational nature of what the National Western could be as an anchor for agriculture, not only nationally, but globally.
Mhm.
And in furtherance of that notion, again, when I was still in the last year or two, perhaps, or three of my tenure as CEO, Ray Chamberlain, formerly a chancellor of Carter State University in Fort Collins, was a consultant to National Western. Ray and I talked, and we both agreed that we should meet with the president of Carter State University to see if we could build a partnership with CSU. I had been for 4 years on the CSU Board of Governors,
Mhm.
and in my last year as chair, Ray and I went visit the then Chancellor and President of CSU, Larry Penley. And I made the statement that CSU needed a beachhead in Denver. University of Colorado had 4 or 5 institutional institutions of quality around the state. CSU had none. See, other than Fort Collins, and while reputation was superb, it did not have any real presence in Denver. I made a pitch to Larry with Ray Chamberlain. Larry Penley discounted that and said, that'll never happen. We left, not in frustration, but concerned
Mhm.
as to why that would be said.
Mhm.
But the seed had been planted.
Mhm.
And when Larry stepped down, Tony Frank became chancellor and president of CSU.
Mhm.
He listened. He was not non-committal, but he was very interested in the idea of having a presence in Denver. So here we come to the who is in his own mind trying to evaluate National Western situation. Obviously, he's trying to build a cabinet. He's in the first few years of his first term. He's building support, and this has had to have been one of the real challenges facing him. No doubt he was under significant pressure. He, on this issue, probably, I'm sure, to keep National Western in Denver. During my last year or two, I had received scathing criticism from a lot of people on how could I move National Western. Now, when I use the word I'm more than happy to take all the slings and arrows and shots and punches for having made a decision that I think was a proper decision to engage other institutions and cities in this discussion. But friends were not happy and others were not happy. No doubt Mayor Hancock was receiving a lot of these same kind of comments, how you can't possibly move. In 2012, a year after Hancock had been elected, he asked Dura, the Urban Renewal Authority, to do a study of National Western's buildings and, I believe, seek a preliminary thought or judgment as to whether we should move.
Mhm.
the president of Dura and give you these statements and statements that I believe are factual.
Mhm.
Understand that my recollection of history and facts may be different from others, and I readily understand, but she was quite clear, and it took courage for her to stand up and say, National Western, you've got terrible buildings, but I think you can move to the west side. 13 Mayor Hancock announced the interest of the National Western. Rachel, are we good?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. All of a sudden our internet crashed, and so I had to run and plug into a hard line. So I ran down the hallway. So it was still recording. So it actually caught you saying that. It just didn't have me here. So, but I am back now. I am gonna mute while you're talking, just so that people have background ambient noise now that I'm back in my cubicle, that we don't capture that. So if I need to respond to you, it'll take me just a second to unmute. But otherwise, we're all set.
Not a problem. So in 2013, Mayor Hancock rejected the idea of a relocation, with which I was very supportive. And he sanctioned and agreed to, and the city agreed to, a study to be undertaken in late 2013 and 2014 from a consulting group called Strategic Advisory Group, otherwise known as SAG. SAG made a study knowing at that time that the decision had been made to keep Stock Show in Denver. SAG endorsed, and it used these words, which I am repeating from its study, endorsed, and I quote, a sweeping, close quote, overhaul of the site is needed. That was needed to overcome the significant constraints of being bounded on the south by I-70, the river on the west by the river, on the east by a narrow two-lane, on the north by less available land. But it said that to keep National Western as a top stock show, to have it develop into a national sports complex, and to engage National Western as a prime venue for national horse shows, it should and can stay, but at significant cost. It also endorsed Mayor Hancock's notion of redeveloping Stock Show at its current site as a way to help rebuild Northeast Denver, which had been ignored in the minds of lots of community people. And so it endorsed the idea of anchoring the North Denver cornerstone, I believe it was called. It endorsed a new governance and management structure of a third-party authority called the National Western Center Authority. We, Stock Show, had expressed and said that we thought we could be the overall entity to oversee the redevelopment. The mayor disagreed, which we respected and said no, he wanted it to be in a third party entity, and that was called National Western Center. The person, that SAG study also endorsed the idea of National Western bringing in partners beside City and County of Denver and National Western. It endorsed wholeheartedly the idea of Colorado State University being at the table, Denver Museum of Science and Technology and being a partner, and History Colorado being a partner. That study really started to move the marble, so to speak. Thereafter, to my best memory, meetings were held, planning meetings, site meetings were held at a downtown engineering firm, which name I forget, but the person sort of leading the engineering review of this site was Eric Anderson. I'll never forget, and there were several meetings chaired by or run by Eric Anderson, including 10, 15 city people, 3 or 4 National Western people, particularly Paul Andrews, Ron Williams, myself, and a consultant or 2. I'll never forget one of those meetings. Eric Anderson showed 3 to 4 different prospective site plans. And Paul Andrews is another individual who has played an absolutely critical role in this overall development. Paul Andrews got up and said 3 of those 4 plans will not work, cannot work, and you people need to reject those in favor of one that can work and will work. And so the group endorsed his thinking and agreed to his thinking. I don't need to get into those plans. That was endorsed was to consolidate the rail lines going right down the middle of the complex in favor of one spur rail line that would move up to and parallel to and next to the Burlington Northern Mainline Railroad. That was a significant, important step. There were meetings throughout 2014, and I cannot recall the exact date, but I remember attending all these meetings, and at this point in time, remember again that Ron Williams is chairman of the board. Ron Williams had asked me to chair what he called the long-range planning group. When I had stepped down as president CEO, I was asked to chair the long-range planning group by Jerry McMorris. Ron Williams continued that, so they could and would be of help in helping develop this vision of recreating and redeveloping the National Western. But and so I attended a lot of meetings. two or three meetings stand out in my memory. One meeting, and I believe it was in late 2014, but it could have been 2015. One meeting in particular was with Crystal D. Herrera, the deputy city attorney, Kelly Lead, who is really not only Kelly Lead, but the lead in many respects as Mayor Hancock's point man for this National Western Center. And Maria Garcia Berry, our lobbyist, and Paul Andrews, myself. I must give true and proper credit and attribution to Kelly Lead for being a strong, pretty hard-nosed leader, and he was tough. He was tough. Times his style was a little abrasive, but overall he was very effective and very strong, and he deserves a lot of credit for how this developed as well. But in that meeting, I'll never forget, here's Crystal representing the city of Denver as a lawyer. And I, as a lawyer by training, said, I don't think this meeting is a fair meeting. You've got your lawyer. We were not asked to include our lawyer. And Crystal nodded and said, I understand. And I said, secondly, I don't like the idea of our having to convey our land to the city and county of Denver as part of the understanding that Denver will support and sustain a significant part of this redevelopment cost. On certain terms, and she's very bright, she's very able, and I respect her a lot. She said that will not work, Pat, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to go there. So it was clear that that was probably a road we could not pursue, but I made the point, and I felt strongly about the point, that the reason our land was so important to us is it gave us security and it gave us leverage in our negotiations with the city. That was a precursor to a meeting somewhere around this time. And again, it could have been in 2004, late 2014 or 2015. I'm not sure. I was resisting the transfer of land to the city, but it was clear that I would not prevail on that. So then our backup position was to say, okay, let us convey the land to the city as the redevelopment occurs and works. So there was a meeting I had with the mayor and his chief of staff, Alan Salazar, and I think Kelly Lee. It was a quite heated meeting. I made my push and the mayor pushed back quite strongly. There were, there were strong wills on both sides of the table, but there was mutual respect on both sides of the table. Mayor Hancock, and I'll never forget this, said, Pat, without that land, I'm hanging out and I'm going to suffer a lot of criticism from those people upstairs, meaning city council members. I have got to have this land. And we need this land and we need you to convey it. When that meeting occurred, I cannot say, but it did occur. In 2015, ballot issue 2C went to the voters endorsing this major redevelopment project and endorsing a $6 commitment to the redevelopment of Stock Show. Ballot 2C passed overwhelmingly in the city. It passed in all districts, councilmanic districts, and it passed in every precinct, I'm told and I believe. So it was a very strong statement of support. That passed. We were thrilled. We were delighted. In 2016, Ron Williams stepped aside and said, Pat, I'm got too much on my plate. You need to take over his chair. So I said, okay, but only if that's best for Stock Show. He said, yes, it is best for Stock Show. So I became chair in 2016. Sometime after that, and it was late 2016 or early 2017, we started negotiating the framework agreement. We had engaged the lawyer, Tom Reagan-Eddy of Ott & Johnson, a major high-quality law firm downtown Denver, 17th Street, to represent us. The negotiating sessions were in the Ott & Johnson conference room. On our side of the table were our lobbyist, Maria Garcia-Berry, our lawyer, Tom Reagan-Eddy, the president and CEO, Paul Andrews, and myself. On the other side of the table, and I say this with a smile, was what I call a cast of thousands. There were probably 10, 15 people representing the city. Anywhere from, and I say that with no disrespect at all, it was just the need in their view to have the input views of consultants, from the planning office, the city's city attorney's office. Crystal D. Herrera played a primary role, a person that had become more apparent as being very, very able on the city side, but also empathetic and very understanding of Stock Show's thinking and vision and supporting our vision, was a young woman by the name of Gretchen Hollera. Gretchen played a significant role. The person who was making the final decision on each of the negotiating points, as we met in session after session and meeting after meeting, and it spanned over, I want to say 2 or 3 months' time, maybe longer, maybe 4, I just don't remember the term. But we finally reached agreement after Kelly Lee, Mayor Hancock's point person, had agreed to the points. I had a final meeting with Mayor Hancock and with Kelly Lee present, again with Alan Salazar, Chief of Staff, present, on an issue that was of serious concern on our side. Rachel, this might have been the same meeting to which I referred earlier in my conversation with you, with Mayor Hancock, or it may have been a separate meeting. I don't recall which. But this issue, I do recall very specifically coming up as being very important to our side. Not only the land issue, but the fact that we stock show were being asked to and had to raise $50 million to help, in addition to convey for a total of $125 million commitment to this redevelopment project. Our capital campaign people under the chairmanship of Pete Coors significantly constrained in the naming rights associated with the capital campaign. If we could not commit to and guarantee to donors of the capital campaign that those naming rights were in perpetuity and were not term or time limited. Kelly Lee pushed hard back against that. He would not agree to that. And that precipitated the meeting with the mayor. I pushed hard for perpetual permanent naming rights. Kelly Lee opposed it, but then Kelly Lee reluctantly at the end of the meeting agreed to that proposition. Mayor Hancock agreed to that proposition. That was very important to the capital campaign and to Pete. Now, what did that framework agreement, which was finally signed off in August of 2017, say? That agreement, and I'm summarizing, basically said we would commit to be at this site for 50 years with two 25-year extensions, which we all viewed basically as a 100-year commitment. It also provided that there would be, the city would master lease the whole acreage which had been owned by National Western, then conveyed to the city, would master lease all of that land to this new entity, the National Western Center Authority. The National Western Center Authority then would in turn lease back to National Western the same land which we had been using prior to our conveyance or transfer to the city. The framework agreement provided for an 11-member board of directors. The framework agreement also provided for a formula for funding of the National Western Center where there were no revenues coming in. And my recollection is the city and county of Denver agreed to fund 60% of an annual budget figure, and CSU and National Western would each fund 20% for a total of 100%. What that figure was in actual dollars, I do not remember, but that was an agreed upon pro rata sum that we all had agreed upon. And the framework agreement finally agreed in this legal document to fund up to $620 million. When you add the city commitment of 460 or 470 million, And Colorado State University commitment of 200 million, and the state of Colorado 121 million through the regional tourism tax, and the National Western, it comes up to 800 million to $1 billion. Now, I don't have the exact math, but that's our distinct recollection. So there, we have now a legal document signed off by all parties, City and County of Denver, Colorado State University, and the Western Stock Show Association on behalf of National Western Stock Show. And that document was approved by City Council. So it became a full, meaningful legal document, which basically defines National Western future for the next 100 years. That document set the stage then for the formation of a board. And in the document also provided that the mayor could and would appoint, I believe, the chairman of the board and successor chairmen of the board until such time as the complex was built out. The mayor also had the opportunity, or the provision, rather, to appoint several members of the board, which would include, I believe, 3 community members whom he thought would be helpful to and important to the overall dialogue on community interests. He appointed Rob Brown, a businessman of note. He appointed John Zapian, whom I had known for years, but he had been a strong Democrat activist going back 20, 30 years. And John was very strong. There were 2 community neighborhood members, I believe, whose names I forget. Also, in addition, Colorado State University had 2 members, and they were Tony Frank and his vice chancellor for Denver affairs, Amy Parsons, and National Western had 2 members, Paul Andrews as president CEO and me as chairman of the board. And I remember in dialogue and discussion with Ellen Salazar, the mayor's chief of staff, the mayor was very strong on these people, but he was particularly emphatic about the need to have Kelly Lee be on that board, having helped stand up the National Western Center. And we understood that, we supported that. He was very interested in having John Eichard involved in some fashion. And we understood that. I don't recall the chronology or the sequencing specifically, for which I apologize. But I remember interviewing for candidates for the president of the National Western Center. And John Eichert was one of several candidates. Well, John Eichert is a very successful businessman, having run and now chairs First of Denver bank system, I believe is the name, and a very active community leader and civic leader. We had and have great respect for John. John put threw his hat in the ring for president and CEO with others. John, as we went through these interviews, then decided he did not want to pursue a full-time job of standing up a new startup organization. So he withdrew to our disappointment. But the next in line was this woman of color who was on the Los Angeles Dodger staff out in Los Angeles. Her name I forget, but I thought she was outstanding. Others thought she was outstanding. And so we went to her as the president CEO. Well, it developed in further conversations that she had some health issues, and we felt that that was not a situation that would necessarily fit. She may have also on her own withdrawn, I don't know which. But there we had all of a sudden high prospect for the CEO who withdrew, a new possible CEO who could not or would not follow through or do this. And so there was a chair, and Mayor Hancock appointed Joe Garcia, who was head of community colleges in Colorado, to be the chair. I had known Joe when I was on the CSU Board of Governors and interviewed Joe for the CSU Pueblo president position. I thought Joe could do this, and he chaired some meetings and oversaw board activity and board agenda and board meetings. But it became clear to me that Joe was highly pressed by his full-time, and I wasn't convinced. In fact, I became more convinced he did not have the time, nor could he make the commitment. I went to Alan Salazar and said, I'm concerned about Joe Garcia. It is not personal. It is not without due respect, but I don't think he's got the time to make the commitment to oversee the organizational structure and setup of this National Western Center. And I said, would it be all right if I went and talked to Joe directly? And Ellen said yes. I went and talked to Joe directly. I told him exactly what I recall as saying, and he was probably a little disappointed I said that, but I said it in good faith. I said it respectfully, and I said it honestly. About 10 days, a week, 10 days, 2 weeks later, he called up and said, you're right, I need to step aside. I'm not sitting here trying to take credit for that, but I was trying to do what I could to help the startup and setup of this organization. And so Joe, in leaving, suggested and went to Brad Anderson and said, you need to become president CEO. Brad became president, CEO. Joe stepped aside. John Eichert became chairman of the board. And in one of those early meetings, I remember, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit on this, Rachel. Mayor Hancock was very close to a woman supporter of his as mayor, whose name was Jackie Hinman, former chairman and former CEO of the world-renowned engineering firm CH2M Hill. Jackie Hinman was Mayor Hancock's pick as first chairman of the board. Jackie Hinman clearly knew what being a chairman of a board, how to run meetings, how to organize people, how to take charge. I would recommend Steve McCarthy become vice chairman of the board. She said she was supportive of that. Best for the organization, I'll do that. Steve McCarthy became then vice chairman, and Jackie was then chair. Jackie then moved, and that's when she resigned, and that's when Mayor Hancock appointed Joe Garcia to be chairman of the board. I'm sorry, I got my chronology mixed up. So let me summarize my involvement on the board of National Western Center Authority from 1917, mid-1917, end of 1917, 2017 to 2019, when I stepped down as chairman of the board. I was asked to and appointed with Tony's committee. So Tony, Frank, and I, and John Eichert, and Brad comprised the finance committee. That was an important committee because it ended up providing counsel to Brad on budgetary and financial issues. And there were two primary financial pressures. One, recall again, we had no revenues coming in, so any way to pay salaries or pay staff was by levying or making calls upon these equity partners on the 60-20-20 split ratio basis. So we operated under that. We operated under a sense of consensus. There were times that there were concerns about size of staff, but Brad, as president CEO, seemed to carry the day on his priorities and how he was to move forward. The other involvement which I was involved actively was the Community Benefit Committee. there were several community members on the board of the National Western Center Authority that wanted to make sure there was some way in which benefits could flow from National Western Center Authority to the community. And whether that be financial investment or financial transfer from the authority or from members to the community was a significant primary concern. Also, how to structure a community benefit distribution policy was a significant issue. I offered to and drafted a mission statement in the early days of that community benefit committee. And over time that was changed many times to some new revised mission statement. One of the significant events during those 2 years of tenure on that board was the issue of owning the building. The city owned the building, but the city wanted, as I recall, to be removed as owner of that building and would transfer ownership upon a certain cash transaction. Brad oversaw that process. Brad engaged with the board's support in a firm that involved the two Farber boys, sons of Steve Farber, and a developer whose first name is Andy and last name I do not recall. Anyway, Andy and the Farber boys in partnership put together a financial proposal to buy the livestock exchange building from the city and county of Denver with some discount, which the city and county of Denver agreed. And as part of that transaction, the buyers agreed to rebuild, redevelop the most western building of the livestock complex. There are three buildings. East one with the pillars, middle one, which had been burned out by a fire and was in bad shape, and then the far western one where the saloon is, so the livestock saloon is. The buyers agreed to redevelop, and they thought they could come to and put the funding together for redevelopment of the middle building as well as the western building and some modification of the existing livestock exchange building. And Brad put that together. Brad's and the National Western Time gave us the opportunity to have an equity portion of that ownership group as a minority, very minority interest, and that was good. And Brad was committed to the idea of having agricultural centered organizations office in that building. So 2019 comes around, and I've been in the office of chair for 3 years, working hard, and for several reasons, felt that it was time for me to step aside as chair. And so in May or June of 2019, I stepped down as chair and no longer thenceforth was involved or attended meetings. And that's pretty much it, Rachel.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that's invaluable knowledge. And I think you're the 5th or 6th person I've talked to on the project, and all of this was new for me. So I think that your voice is a valuable one to help us understand the story better and to learn more about the project and the background of what's going to be coming up and opening up pretty soon. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to think about it and figure out, figure out all the pieces that we needed to hear about for that, the backstory of that.
Well, I hope it was helpful, and I hope I gave it as factual a statement as I could, and I hope I didn't embarrass anybody or cause any consternation among any of the people I identified or mentioned.
It seemed like you were very respectful of everyone. At least that's my opinion. So I can't see where you'd go wrong on that.
All right.
Thank you so much, Pat, and have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Nice to meet you. And
nice to meet you too.
have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.